Claire Whitmore was 19 years old, 8 months pregnant, and still naive enough to think Christmas dinner might end with disappointment instead of exile. Snow pressed softly against the tall windows of her parents' house in Bellevue, turning the world outside white and silent. But inside the dining room, everything glittered with wealth and control. The crystal glasses caught the chandelier light. Silver cutlery gleamed against linen napkins, folded into perfect triangles. A 12-foot tree shimmered in the corner, decorated in gold and ivory, as if even Christmas in the Whitmore house had to look expensive enough to deserve respect. Around the table sat surgeons, attorneys, donors, and family friends who had spent their lives mistaking status for character. Claire had grown up believing she belonged among them. That night, for the first time, she understood how quickly a family like hers could decide you were disposable. Her mother noticed first. Elaine Whitmore always noticed everything: the wrong fork, a loosened hem, a nervous smile, a secret trying too hard to stay hidden. Claire had worn the loosest dress she owned, layered with a cashmere cardigan, but at 8 months, there was no hiding anything anymore. Elaine set down her wine glass with deliberate care and looked at her daughter from across the table. "Claire?" she said, her voice smooth enough to freeze the room faster than a scream ever could. "Stand up." Conversation died instantly. Her uncle stopped cutting his roast. Her cousin lowered her eyes. Even the soft piano music playing from the built-in speakers seemed to disappear. Claire felt every face in the room turn toward her before she pushed back her chair and rose. For one terrible second, all she could hear was her own heartbeat. Her hands drifted helplessly to the curve of her stomach, as if she could shield the truth now that it was already too late. Her father, Dr. Howard Whitmore, sat at the head of the table like a judge who had been waiting for this exact confession. His expression did not change. "How far along?" he asked. 32 weeks, Claire whispered. No one moved. "And the father?" She swallowed. Noah's name felt warm in her throat, the only honest thing in that room. Noah Bennett. Her mother's mouth tightened. "The electrician?" Claire nodded once. "We're in love." That was when her aunt let out a breath through her nose, almost a laugh, and her older cousin muttered, "Oh my God," under his breath. Howard Whitmore didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "You mean to tell me," he said, folding his hands together on the table, "that after 4 generations of physicians, after everything we invested in your future, you intend to throw your life away for a man who spends his days crawling through walls with wire cutters?" Claire felt the blood rush hot into her face. "Noah is kind," she said, louder this time. "He works hard. He is not one of us," Elaine cut in. Then, with chilling calm, she reached to the sideboard behind her and picked up a thin cream-colored folder. "Prearranged, prepared, planned." Of course it was. "I had someone look into him," she said, opening the file as if she were presenting findings at a board meeting instead of dismantling her daughter's life in front of the family. "His father served time for fraud. The Bennett name is tied to bankruptcy, lawsuits, and disgrace. And this is the man you chose to father your child." Claire's fingers curled against her dress. "I chose a man who stayed," she said. "That matters more than a last name." Her father's chair scraped softly as he leaned back. The sound cut through her like a blade. "Listen carefully," he said. "You will end this relationship. You will take care of the pregnancy situation discreetly. And in the fall you will proceed with medical school exactly as planned. We can still contain this if you stop behaving like a reckless child." For a second, Claire thought she had heard him wrong. The baby shifted inside her, a slow living movement beneath her palm, and something in her hardened. "No," she said. Elaine stared at her. "Claire." "I said no." Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "I'm keeping my baby." Silence crashed over the room. It was so complete, Claire could hear the soft hiss of the fireplace from the next room and the wind pushing snow against the glass. Her father looked at her for a long time, not with anger, but with something colder: disgust sharpened into final judgment. "Then you are no longer my daughter," he said. Across the table, nobody protested. Nobody said her name. Nobody stood up, and in that terrible glittering room, with Christmas lights glowing behind her and her whole family looking away, Claire realized the night had just become the first page of the story they would one day regret writing for her. No one came after her. Years later, when Claire tried to remember that night clearly, that was the part that still hurt the most. Not her father's cold verdict. Not the way her mother had looked at her, as if she were something shameful that had finally been uncovered. It was the fact that no one moved. People who had watched her grow up, praised her grades, hugged her at graduations, and toasted her future every Christmas now, sat in perfect silence while her life collapsed in front of them. Claire stood there for one last second, waiting for someone, anyone to speak. No one did. Then her father looked toward the hallway and said, in the same calm tone he used when ending a discussion at the hospital, "You have 45 minutes." She did not trust herself to answer. She turned and walked out of the dining room before anyone could see how badly her hands were shaking. By the time she reached the top of the staircase, her breathing had gone thin and uneven. Her bedroom door was still half open, the same way she had left it that morning. For one strange moment, the room looked untouched by what had just happened downstairs. The pale blue walls, the desk by the window, the stack of medical school brochures she had once kept like holy objects. Then the truth landed all at once. She was not packing for school. She was not leaving for a weekend. She was being thrown out. Claire pulled her suitcase from the closet and dropped it on the bed. The zipper caught twice because her fingers would not work properly. She started grabbing whatever she could think of, first two sweaters, maternity jeans, underwear, her winter coat, the prenatal vitamins lined up beside her lamp, the folder with her ID and insurance card. She opened the bottom drawer of her dresser and found the baby blanket she had hidden there weeks ago, soft yellow with little white stars stitched along the edge. The sight of it nearly broke her. She pressed it to her chest for a second, eyes burning, then folded it carefully into the suitcase. Footsteps paused in the doorway behind her. Claire turned too quickly and saw her mother standing there. Elaine Whitmore did not look angry anymore. She looked composed, almost bored, which was somehow worse. Claire stared at her, and despite everything, some stupid hopeful part of her still thought maybe this was the moment her mother had come to say enough. Maybe she would close the door, lower her voice, and tell Claire they would figure something out in the morning. Instead, Elaine's eyes shifted past her to the vanity wall, where Claire's senior portrait hung in an ivory frame. Without a word, she walked over and lifted it off the hook. Claire blinked. "Mom?" Elaine tucked the frame under one arm, as if she were taking down seasonal decorations. "I won't have people asking questions." Claire just stared at her. Out of everything that had happened that night, this was the thing that made it feel real. Not the shouting, not the ultimatum. This, her mother removing her face from the wall before she had even left the house. "You're taking my picture down?" Elaine met her eyes then, cool and unflinching. "You made your choice." Claire's grip tightened on the baby blanket. "I'm still your daughter." For the first time, her mother's mask slipped just enough for the cruelty underneath to show. "No," she said quietly. "You were our daughter." Then she walked out, carrying the frame with her. When the 45 minutes were up, Claire had one suitcase, an overstuffed tote bag, and a small box of things she could not bear to leave behind. The house was silent as she made her way downstairs. Somewhere in the dining room, silverware clinked softly against china. They had gone back to dinner. Her father was waiting by the front door. Snow swirled beyond the glass in the porch light, thick and white and relentless. He opened the door before she even reached for it. "Do not come back here expecting this to be fixed," he said. Claire stepped outside before her face could betray her. The cold hit her hard enough to steal her breath. Her suitcase wheel snagged on a crack near the front walk, and she nearly stumbled, one hand flying down to her belly on instinct. Then she saw Noah. He was standing beside his old blue pickup at the curb, shoulders dusted with snow, both hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He must have been waiting there for a while. The front of his hair was damp, and his face was red from the cold. But when he saw her, he moved immediately. He took the suitcase from her without a word, then the tote, then the box, setting everything carefully in the truck like it mattered. "Claire," he said, and his voice was steady, but she could hear the strain under it. He opened the passenger door, then pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. His hand trembled slightly before he flattened it against the edge of the truck. "I stopped by the clerk's office this afternoon," he said. "I asked what we'd need." Claire looked at him through a blur of tears. Noah swallowed. "We can go Monday. Get the license. Start whatever comes next." He hesitated, then added, softer, "I know this is a mess, but I'm not letting you do it alone." That was the moment she finally cried. Not when her father cast her out. Not when her mother took her picture off the wall. But there, in the snow, beside a battered pickup truck, with a 22-year-old electrician standing in front of her trying not to shake, Claire understood the difference between people who shared her blood and the man who had chosen to stay. Claire cried most of the way to Renton, though by the time Noah pulled his truck into the narrow alley behind his building, her tears had quieted into the kind of raw, exhausted silence that hurts more than sobbing ever could. Noah did not ask her to explain anything. He seemed to understand that whatever had happened in that house had been cruel enough, without forcing her to repeat it out loud. He just drove carefully through the snow, the heater rattling, the windshield wipers beating out a tired rhythm against the glass. Once, at a red light, he reached across the seat and squeezed her hand. That was all. Claire held on to that touch harder than she meant to. Noah's apartment sat above a hardware store, up one narrow flight of stairs that smelled faintly of sawdust, old paint, and cold metal. It was small enough that Claire could take it in almost all at once from the doorway. A worn brown couch, a lamp with a crooked shade, a kitchen no bigger than a closet, and a little dining table shoved against the wall with two mismatched chairs. The radiator clanged like it resented being alive. One cabinet in the kitchen hung lower than the rest. It was nothing like the polished perfection of the Whitmore house. And yet the moment Noah flicked on the lamp, carried in her suitcase, and shut the door against the storm, Claire felt safer than she had all night. For the first few days, they moved around each other carefully, as if both of them understood that shock had made everything fragile. Claire slept badly and woke often, one hand on her stomach, disoriented by the unfamiliar room and the memory of her mother lifting her portrait off the wall. Noah left for work before sunrise and came home smelling like insulation, cold air, and wire dust. He never asked when she would stop crying or what her parents had said after she left. Instead, he did small things. He cleared half a dresser without mentioning it. He brought home crackers when morning sickness hit again. He nailed a loose strip of molding by the bathroom because she'd tripped on it once. He set an extra plate on the table at dinner, as if she had always belonged there. Little by little, he made space for her life without making her feel like a burden. The earliest appointment they could get was 2 Mondays later, so that gray morning in January, they drove to the King County courthouse with a folder of paperwork on the seat between them. Claire wore a cream sweater dress and the only decent coat she still owned. Noah had on a dark button-down shirt that looked stiff from being ironed too carefully. There were no flowers, no music, no family waiting with smiles and cameras. Just fluorescent lights, damp winter air, and strangers moving in and out of government offices with folders tucked under their arms. Their witnesses ended up being 2 people who happened to be there that morning. Linda Perez, a retired school teacher filing property documents, and Aaron Cole, a young attorney, waiting on a client who was running late. Both agreed with a kindness Claire had not expected from anyone anymore. The ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes. The judge spoke quickly, as though he had long ago learned that some marriages began with fanfare, and some began with necessity, and both were still marriages. When Noah said, "I do," he looked directly at Claire, steady and sure. When she said it back, her voice trembled, but not from doubt. She was frightened, yes, she was heartbroken. She was carrying too much grief for someone her age. But standing beside him in that plain courthouse, Claire also felt something she had not felt in days. Chosen. Afterward, Linda insisted on taking a picture of them with a disposable camera she'd found in the bottom of her purse. "Trust me," she said with a knowing smile. "Someday you'll want proof that you were this young." Noah laughed under his breath, and to Claire's surprise, she laughed too. They went across the street to a diner because it was affordable and warm. Noah ordered pancakes. Claire ordered chicken soup she barely touched. They sat in the booth with their marriage certificate between them, and the silence felt nothing like the silence in her parents' dining room. That silence had humiliated her. This one held her up. Lily Bennett arrived 8 weeks later on a rain-soaked March morning, red-faced, healthy, and furious from her first breath. Noah cried the second the nurse placed her in his arms. Claire watched him look down at their daughter, as if he had been waiting his whole life to love someone exactly that much, and something inside her settled. Whatever had been broken on Christmas night had not destroyed her. It had led her here. A month after Lily was born, Claire made one last mistake. Or maybe it was hope. Sleep-deprived and sore and staring at her daughter's tiny face in the glow of the apartment lamp, she sent a final email to her parents. It was simple. "Lily is here. She's healthy. If you want to meet your granddaughter even once, I'll let you." She stayed awake half the night waiting for an answer that never came. The reply arrived at 8:14 the next morning, and it wasn't from her mother or father. It was from her mother's assistant. "Dr. and Dr. Whitmore request that you do not contact this address again. They have no granddaughter." Claire printed the email at the public library on a Tuesday morning, while Lily slept in her stroller beside the copier. The machine whirred, spat out the page, and there it was in black ink, flat and undeniable. "They have no granddaughter." Claire stood there for a second longer than she meant to, one hand resting on the stroller handle, her eyes fixed on the sentence as if staring at it hard enough might make it read differently. It did not. It wasn't even signed by her mother or father. Just a message from an assistant, cold and efficient, as if Claire were some stranger bothering a medical office instead of a daughter who had offered them one last chance. She folded the page carefully and slid it into the side pocket of Lily's diaper bag. She told herself it was for practical reasons, in case she ever needed to remember the exact wording. The truth was simpler than that. She did not want time softening what they had chosen to be. After that, life narrowed into routines, so demanding there was no room left for fantasy. The first year with Lily passed in feedings, laundry, short naps, overdue bills, and the kind of exhaustion that changed shape but never really lifted. Claire stopped checking her inbox with hope in her chest. She stopped wondering whether her parents would send a card, or flowers, or some stiff, late attempt at repair. Nothing came. Noah worked full days wiring new construction, then picked up evening jobs, whenever he could, swapping out dead outlets in old duplexes, repairing overloaded panels, crawling through attics full of insulation and dust, for people who always seemed surprised that a young man with rough hands could also be patient. He came home tired enough to barely straighten his back some nights, but he still brought things with him. Discount diapers from a warehouse in Kent, cans of soup, a bag of clementines, Claire had mentioned once in passing, a second-hand baby mobile. He repainted at the kitchen table because the old colors looked too faded. Claire built her days around Lily's sleep. If the baby napped for 30 minutes, Claire reviewed medical terminology. If she slept for an hour, Claire worked through coding exercises online before the next feeding or diaper change. Their apartment was so small that every part of their life spilled into every other part. The bassinet sat just a few feet from the couch, bottles dried beside Noah's tools near the sink. The changing pad was folded and slid under the bed when company came over, which was almost never. At night, after Noah got home, they ate inexpensive dinners at the little table against the wall while Lily dozed nearby, and they talked in tired, practical voices about gas money, class deadlines, invoices, and whether they could risk waiting another month to replace Noah's tires. It was hard. Claire would never lie about that. But it was also honest. Nobody in that apartment made her feel ashamed for needing help. By the time Lily was 11 months old, Claire had begun to understand that poverty had its own rhythm. Then winter hit hard. Rain slammed against the windows for days, gray and relentless, and on the fourth night Lily woke crying in a way Claire had never heard before. She lifted her daughter out of the crib and felt the heat immediately. Lily's skin was burning. Her tiny face was flushed, her breathing quick, her body limp in a way that sent panic straight through Claire's chest. She checked the thermometer once, frowned, shook it, and checked again. 103.4. For a moment, she just stood there in the dim apartment, Lily hot and whimpering against her shoulder, the digital screen glowing in her hand. Noah was still out in Tacoma on an emergency restaurant job, helping restore power after a breaker failure in a kitchen. Claire knew all of that. She knew he would come as soon as he could. But panic is older than logic, and without thinking, she reached for her phone and scrolled to a number she had never managed to delete. Dr. Elaine Whitmore. The woman who had built a career telling frightened parents what to do when their children were sick. The woman who had refused to meet her own granddaughter. Claire's thumb hovered over the call button. She stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then the front door opened and Noah came in carrying the cold and rain with him. He took one look at Claire's face, then at Lily in her arms, and crossed the room immediately. What happened? Fever, Claire said, her voice thin. 103.4. He touched Lily's forehead, his jaw tightening. Then he saw the phone still in Claire's hand. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Gently, Noah lowered the phone from her fingers and set it on the counter. "We're taking her in," he said. Now, at the ER, the lights were too bright, and the waiting room smelled like bleach and stale coffee. Lily cried through the exam, then sagged against Claire's shoulder in exhausted little hiccups, while the doctor checked her ears and listened to her lungs. Ear infection. High fever. Scary but manageable. Antibiotics. Fluids. Watch her breathing. Claire nodded through all of it, barely hearing herself answer questions. 3 weeks later, the bill arrived. $1,268. Noah sat down at the table, did the math, and called the hospital to arrange $50 a month. That night, after Lily was finally asleep with medicine in her system, Claire found the printed email still tucked in the diaper bag pocket. She stared at it for a long time, then slid it into a manila folder and wrote across the tab in black marker. For when Lily asks, Claire kept the folder in the back of the top kitchen cabinet, tucked behind a dented roasting pan and a stack of chipped bowls nobody ever reached for unless they had to. She didn't open it often. Only when life handed her something too painful, too official, or too important to trust to memory alone. Over time, it became less of a file and more of a quiet habit, the place where hard things went when there wasn't enough money or energy to deal with them properly. Life kept moving anyway. By the time Lily was 3, survival no longer felt like a crisis every day. It felt like routine. Claire had finished her certification by then and found an entry-level job in medical records at a clinic in South Seattle. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and steady had started to feel holy. Noah was working more than ever, full days on electrical crews and extra jobs when he could get them. They still talked about groceries like strategy, and still checked their bank balance before buying anything that wasn't essential, but the panic had eased just enough for them to think in months instead of hours. For the first time, there was a version of the future that didn't look like borrowed time. In the spring of 2011, while the housing market was still limping from the crash, Noah began studying listings the way some people studied weather reports: bank-owned houses, foreclosures, places other buyers avoided because they needed too much work. Most of them were impossible, too damaged, too expensive, too far from both of their jobs. Then one Saturday, he came home with a folded printout in his jacket pocket and set it on the table between Lily's crayons and Claire's stack of unpaid utility bills. "There's a house in Tacoma," he said. Claire glanced up. "That sounds expensive already." He almost smiled. "Not this one. Bank-owned. Been sitting empty. Price dropped twice." 2 days later, they drove down to see it. The neighborhood looked tired but lived in. The kind of street where people still kept flower pots on their porches even if the sidewalks were cracked and the paint on the trim had started to peel. The house itself leaned toward ruin. The gutters sagged. The porch rail wobbled under Noah's hand. Inside, the air smelled like damp plaster, old wood, and something stale that had settled into the walls after too many empty months. The kitchen floor dipped slightly near the sink. Yellow stains spread across one bedroom ceiling. A cabinet door hung loose by one hinge. Noah moved through the rooms in silence at first, checking outlets, unscrewing a panel, crouching near baseboards with a flashlight between his teeth. Claire followed with Lily perched on her hip, watching his face more than the house. She had learned by then that Noah didn't waste energy pretending something was better than it was. When he finally stood in the kitchen again, he looked tired and focused in that same familiar way. "Well?" Claire asked. He exhaled. "The wiring's bad. Some of it's ancient, some of it's amateur work, and some of it honestly looks dangerous." "That doesn't sound promising." "No," he said, glancing around again. "But the bones are good. Foundation's solid, framing solid. It needs a lot, but it can be saved." Claire shifted Lily higher against her side. "Can we afford something that can be saved?" Noah reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded notebook page covered in numbers. Down payment, mortgage estimate, repair costs, materials. A narrow margin at the bottom that looked more like hope than certainty. He had done the math 3 different ways, and all 3 versions came down to the same answer. Only if they were careful, and only if he did most of the work himself. Claire studied the page, then the kitchen, then Noah. "This is going to take everything we have." "I know. And if something goes wrong?" He met her eyes. "Then we deal with it. Same as we always do." That was not reassurance in the way her parents would have defined it. There was no cushion, no trust fund, no guarantee. But it was honest, and honesty had become more valuable to Claire than comfort. She looked down at Lily, who pointed at the broken breakfast nook, and announced, with total confidence, "My room yellow." Noah laughed. Claire surprised herself by laughing too. So they bought the house. The apartment in Renton had been a shelter. This place, even half broken, felt different from the start. It was not somewhere they were hiding until life improved. It was something they were building on purpose. For 11 straight weeks, Noah worked 1 paid shift and 1 unpaid shift every day. Construction site first, then home. He rewired the house, room by room, often with Lily sitting on the floor nearby, with plastic tools spread around her knees, asking solemn questions about lights and switches, while Claire patched walls, scrubbed cabinets, and painted trim after work. Little by little the place changed. Safe outlets replaced scorched ones. Hallway lights stopped flickering. Lily's room turned soft yellow because she insisted it looked like sunshine. One evening, while tearing into part of the basement wall to replace old wire, Noah pulled out a wad of brittle newspaper someone had stuffed between the studs decades ago. Claire was upstairs rinsing out paintbrushes when the house went strangely quiet. By the time she stepped into the backyard, Noah was standing beside the metal burn barrel with a lit match in his hand, the newspaper already curling into black ash. "What was it?" she asked. For a second, he didn't answer. Then he said, without looking at her, "Just old trash from the walls." But Claire had already seen the headline before the fire took it. Ray Bennett, his father's name. Another story about debt, lies, and the ruins he had left behind. Claire didn't push. Noah watched the paper burn down to nothing, then dropped the match into the barrel and went back inside. A second later, the kitchen light flicked on, steady and warm, and for the first time, Claire looked at that battered old house and thought, not just we can survive here, we might actually belong here. For years afterward, Claire would think one of the greatest gifts she and Noah had given Lily was something neither of them had ever said out loud. It was the absence of fear. Lily did not brace herself when doors closed too hard. She did not go quiet at the dinner table because she sensed an adult mood shifting. She never learned to confuse criticism with love or silence with authority. In their house, work was normal, stress was real, and money was often tight. But affection was never treated like something that had to be earned. By the time Lily was 11, Claire could see the shape of that security in 100 small things. The way her daughter left library books stacked all over the yellow bedroom they had painted years earlier. The way she spoke to adults without shrinking. The way she looked genuinely pleased, not embarrassed, when Noah showed up to school in work boots and a faded work jacket because he had come straight from a job site. That fall, Lily came home from school quieter than usual. Not upset exactly, but thoughtful. Claire noticed right away. She was standing at the stove, letting garlic soften in olive oil, while Noah crouched under the kitchen sink replacing a valve that had started dripping again. The house smelled like dinner and rain, and the faint metallic tang of Noah's toolbox by the back door. Lily set down her backpack, shrugged off her jacket, and climbed onto one of the stools at the counter. "Mom?" Claire looked over. "What's up?" Lily rested her chin in both hands. "How come I don't have grandparents?" The question landed softly, but Claire felt it all the way down. She turned off the burner so nothing would hiss or sputter while she answered. Noah must have sensed the change in the room because he slid out from under the sink and sat back on the floor, quiet, giving Claire space but staying close enough to matter. "You do," Claire said carefully. "They're just not part of our lives." Lily frowned. "Because of Dad?" Claire glanced once at Noah. He didn't look away. "Partly," she said. "And because of me. When I was pregnant with you, my parents decided they cared more about how things looked than about us. They didn't think your dad was good enough. They thought I was ruining my life." Lily turned toward Noah so fast it almost made Claire smile. "They thought Dad wasn't good enough?" Noah wiped his hands on a rag and shrugged. "People believe dumb things when they care too much about status." Lily absorbed that in silence. Then she looked around the kitchen. At the under-cabinet lights Noah had installed. At Claire's papers stacked neatly beside the phone. At the science quiz she had brought home that morning, still clipped to the fridge with a magnet because Claire hadn't yet had time to hang it up. At the pans simmering on the stove and the ordinary warmth of a room built by two people who had never once made her feel unwanted. "Were they right?" she asked. Claire could have answered for her. Instead, she said, "What do you think?" Lily thought about it for only a second. "I think they were wrong." Claire felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even realized she was still carrying. "Me too," she said. Lily nodded once, grabbed a baby carrot from the cutting board, and wandered off to finish her homework, as if she had just settled a matter that no longer needed discussion. But the question stayed with Claire long after dinner. Not because Lily had asked it, but because she had asked it without bitterness. Without longing, even. Just curiosity. That told Claire more than anything else could have. Her daughter didn't feel deprived. She felt loved. After that, the years moved faster. Claire went from clinic records to patient finance, then into hospital administration, learning an entire language of claims, authorizations, denials, and billing systems until people with far more experience than she had started coming to her for answers. Noah's business grew the slow, solid way real businesses do. One truck became a licensed company. One recommendation turned into 10. He didn't advertise much. He just did the work right, charged fairly, and became the name people passed to neighbors when they needed someone honest. By the time Lily reached high school, Bennett Electric Services had become one of those local companies people trusted because it had earned that trust the hard way. Lily grew into herself right alongside them. She won a science fair in middle school with a project on infectious disease transmission, and later spent Saturdays volunteering at a community health drive through a school service program, handing out forms, taking clipboards from nervous patients, asking practical questions no one had taught her to ask. Claire noticed, then what she would later admit, had probably been true much earlier. Lily was not drawn to medicine because of prestige. She was drawn to usefulness. The summer after her junior year, they were sitting on the back porch while the lights stretched long over the yard, and the air still smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass from next door. Lily had just gotten another report card full of the kind of grades guidance counselors got excited about. "I've been thinking," she said, tucking one leg under herself in the porch chair. I want to do pre-med. Claire looked at her for a moment. You know you don't have to do that because of me, right? Lily frowned. I'm not. Or because of what happened with my parents. Lily shook her head. That's not why. She looked out over the yard before adding, more quietly. I want to do it because I like science, and I want my work to actually matter. And because I've watched you and Dad help people my whole life, just in different ways. From the porch swing, Noah gave a small nod. Lily smiled a little. Also, I kind of like the idea of proving you don't need a family name to do something important. Claire looked away before her daughter could see how much that landed. Her parents had once believed they were the gatekeepers of what a future in medicine should look like. Yet everything worthy in Lily, her discipline, her kindness, her sense of purpose had been built far from them, in a house they would have looked down on, and a family they had been too arrogant to deserve. Claire might have held on to that porch conversation a little longer if the envelope had arrived on an ordinary day. Instead, it came on a bright Wednesday near the end of September, when the air over Tacoma had turned sharp enough to hint at fall, but the light was still deceptively clear. Claire was at work in an office outside Seattle, buried in denied claims and prior authorization disputes. Lily was in the first chaotic weeks of her freshman semester at the University of Washington, trying to find her footing between lecture halls, lab schedules, and the strange freedom of being 19 and suddenly responsible for her own life. Noah was home that morning at the kitchen table, legal pad open beside a mug of coffee gone half cold, working through estimates for a rewiring job and a panel replacement in Federal Way when the doorbell rang. The FedEx driver handed him a thick envelope and asked for a signature. Noah signed without thinking much about it at first. Then he looked down and saw the return address stamped in dark blue across the upper left corner. Hargrove and Tate Solicitors, London. The envelope was heavier than normal mail, expensive in that quiet, formal way that already felt like trouble. He opened it with a butter knife from the drying rack and unfolded the first page. By the third line, something in his face changed. He called Claire before he finished reading. She answered on the second ring, distracted, still half in work mode. Hey, I've got 5 minutes before my next meeting. What's wrong? There was a pause long enough to make her push her chair back from the desk. Claire, Noah said, and his voice was so flat it frightened her more than panic would have. I need you to come home. She was already reaching for her bag. Did something happen? Another pause. Then, it's from my father. For a second, the sentence didn't land. Noah almost never used those words. My father belonged to a category of silence in their marriage, something Claire understood mostly through absence. Ray Bennett existed as fragments. The article Noah had burned in the backyard years earlier, the half-finished facts nobody liked touching, the shape of damage left behind by a man who had walked away and stayed gone. No calls, no letters, no attempts to explain himself. No birthdays, no apologies. Just a long blank space where a father should have been. Claire left work less than 5 minutes later. When she got home, Noah was still at the kitchen table, exactly where she had imagined him, one forearm braced against the wood, the packet spread out in front of him. The whole room felt unnaturally still. Even his coffee sat untouched beside the legal pad. Claire set her keys on the counter. What is it? Without answering right away, Noah slid the first page across the table. The letter was formal, polished, and somehow crueler for being so precise. Hargrove and Tate represented Raymond Bennett, currently residing in Surrey, England. Mr. Bennett, age 64, was in serious decline and wished to notify his only son, Noah Bennett, that he had named him sole beneficiary of an estate valued at approximately 12 million US dollars. There was additional language about urgency, family contact, and enclosed medical records. Claire read the number twice. $12 million. In another family, that might have been the story. In theirs, it barely registered. She looked up at Noah, but his expression had not changed. He didn't look shocked by the money. He looked sickened by the reason the letter existed at all. Keep going, he said. Claire turned the page. The next documents were medical summaries, consultant notes, lab reports. Years in hospital administration had taught her how to read them quickly, and what she saw was bad enough without anyone softening it. Chronic liver disease, renal decline, complications stacking on top of complications. A body failing in several directions at once. One typed memo from a specialist, stripped of all sentiment, made it plain that time was no longer measured comfortably. Then Claire found the line that made her stop. Biologic relatives identified for preliminary donor suitability review. She lifted her eyes slowly. "He's not just reaching out because he's dying," she said. "No." Noah's voice was quiet now, tighter than before. "He needs something." Claire kept reading. The solicitor's language was more cautious than the medical notes, but the meaning was the same. Ray Bennett hoped to meet with his son and son's family before his passing and discuss urgent medical circumstances. Given his condition and narrowing treatment options, biologic relatives had become relevant to ongoing evaluation. Claire turned one more page and felt the blood leave her face. Attached behind the letter was a briefing memo. Too detailed, too personal, too invasive to be harmless. It listed their home address, Noah's contractor license number, Claire's job title, and a short profile on Lily. 19 years old, first-year university student, pre-med track, excellent health. There was also a note that information gathered through private investigation and background research suggested she might be an appropriate candidate for preliminary review. Claire put the page down more carefully than she meant to. "He had someone look into us." Noah gave a short nod. Into them was bad enough. Into Lily was something else entirely. Their daughter was barely a month into the life she had worked so hard to earn, and already some stranger across an ocean had reduced her to compatibility, health, and usefulness. "Does Lily know?" Claire asked. "No." Noah looked toward the hallway. Toward nothing. "I wanted to understand what this was before I dragged her into it." For a long moment, they both stared at the paperwork spread across the same kitchen table where they had once sorted bills, school forms, and grocery coupons. $12 million, a dying man, a father who had vanished, a daughter who had done nothing except be healthy, loved, and 19. Finally, Claire asked, "What do we tell her?" Noah was quiet for a beat, as if he were looking past the papers and seeing every year that had brought them here: the apartment in Renton, the yellow bedroom, the science ribbons, the porch where Lily had said she wanted her work to matter. Then he looked at Claire and said, "The truth, all of it." And in that moment, Claire understood something with a clarity that felt almost physical. The past had not come back to apologize. It had come back asking for a piece of their daughter. Claire and Noah did not call Lily that first night. They sat at the kitchen table instead. The solicitor's letter and medical records spread between them, reading the same pages over and over, as if repetition might somehow soften what was there. It never did. The money stayed obscene. The illness stayed real. And beneath both of those was the part Claire couldn't stop circling back to. Ray Bennett had remembered his family only when his body started failing him. Not when Noah got married. Not when Lily was born. Not when years passed with no word at all. Only now, when time had narrowed and he needed something he could not buy. Noah barely touched dinner. Claire served it anyway, then wrapped both untouched plates an hour later and slid them into the fridge. The whole house felt unsettled, as if the walls themselves had somehow learned that someone outside them had been looking in. Claire kept hearing that phrase from the memo in her head: private investigation and background research. It sounded neat, but there was nothing harmless about what it really meant. It meant strangers had spent weeks turning their daughter's ordinary life into a file. The next morning, Noah printed the memo. He laid the pages flat on the kitchen table and tapped one paragraph with the side of his finger. "Look at the dates." Claire leaned in. The report covered 6 weeks. There were notes on Noah's work schedule, Claire's hospital role, and Lily's first month at school. Short entries, timestamps, locations. Tiny pieces of a life none of them had agreed to share. Subject observed leaving campus science building at 2:14 p.m. Subject carrying coffee and anatomy textbook. Subject appears in good health. Subject seen attending first-year campus events. No visible medical concerns. Blood type believed to be O positive. Claire felt a chill move through her. There were photos attached too. One showed Noah unloading equipment from a Bennett electric van. Another caught Claire crossing from the parking garage toward her office. The third made Claire stop breathing for a second. Lily. On campus, turning her head slightly as if she had just heard someone call her name. Backpack over one shoulder. Hair caught by the wind. She looked exactly like what she was young, busy, unsuspecting. They followed her, Claire said. Noah's jaw flexed once, for weeks. Claire touched the edge of the page. How would they know her blood type? Noah exhaled through his nose. I don't know. Old records. A data leak. Something bought from someone who never should have had access. It doesn't matter. They never should have known any of it. That was the part Claire could not move past. Not the inheritance. Not even the disease. Lily had been reduced to health, age, and usefulness before anyone had bothered to ask what she wanted. They called her that afternoon and asked if she could come home for the weekend. Claire tried to sound normal, but Lily knew them too well. What happened? She asked immediately. It's not a phone conversation, Noah said. Can you come home? There was a beat of silence on the line. Okay, Lily said. I'll take the Friday train. By Friday evening she was back, dropping her duffel by the stairs and studying their faces before she had even taken off her jacket. You're both acting weird, she said. What is this? Noah motioned toward the kitchen. Every document was arranged in neat stacks, but this time the photos sat on top. Claire thought that had been Noah's choice. Not the legal letter first. Not the money. The proof. Lily walked over, glanced down, and frowned. Is someone sick? Noah pulled out a chair for her. My father is. She blinked. The one who left? Yes. Claire slid the solicitor's letter across the table. He's living in England. He's dying. And his lawyers contacted us. Lily sat down slowly and began to read. Her face barely changed through the first page. She read more carefully when she reached the medical summaries, her freshman pre-med instincts already parsing terms faster than Claire would have expected. But when she got to the memo, something in her went still. Not dramatically. Just enough that Claire noticed. Lily picked up the page again. Her fingers tightened around the corner. These are dates, she said. Noah didn't answer. She read another line, then looked up. These are my dates. Claire nodded once. Lily's eyes dropped to the photo of herself. Her thumb stopped against the paper, and stayed there for a second too long. He had me followed? For 6 weeks, Noah said. Silence settled over the kitchen. Then Lily turned the page, and found the line about donor review. Claire saw her eyes stop, back up, and read it again. He thinks I could be a match, Lily said quietly. Noah leaned forward, forearms on the table. He thinks you might be useful. It was a harsh sentence, but not an untrue one. Claire flinched anyway. Lily set the papers down very carefully. She didn't cry, she didn't spiral. But the stillness in her looked harder now, more deliberate. I want to get tested, she said. Claire stared at her. Lily, not because I'm saying yes. Her voice was steady, but she was still gripping the edge of the memo. Because I want facts. If strangers are going to drag my name and my body into this, then I get to know exactly what they think they're asking for. Noah held her gaze for a long moment. And Claire saw it then, not just how much Lily looked like him, but how much she resembled the life they had built together. Calm under pressure. Thoughtful. Impossible to corner once she understood where the boundary was. For the first time since the envelope arrived, Claire understood this wasn't only about the past coming back. It was about whether their daughter would let someone else define her future in terms of what could be taken from her. Lily's first test was supposed to be simple. Just blood work, the transplant coordinator had said, a preliminary step to determine whether further evaluation was even worth discussing. Nothing binding. Nothing dramatic. Claire repeated those words to herself the entire drive to Seattle the following Monday, as if saying them often enough might make the morning feel ordinary. It didn't. The hospital garage was too bright, the elevator too slow, the 10th floor waiting room too clean in the way medical spaces often are when they want to look calm for people who are not. Lily checked in with her student ID and insurance card, then sat between Claire and Noah with her backpack at her feet and one hand resting lightly over the crook of her other arm, already anticipating the needle. She was 19, composed, and visibly trying not to comfort them. The transplant coordinator, a woman named Denise, with kind eyes and efficient hands, explained the process with practiced clarity. Basic blood typing, metabolic panel, tissue marker screening, if the first results made that reasonable. Additional steps later, if Lily chose to continue. Denise was careful with every word, careful in the way people in ethically messy corners of medicine learn to be. Claire appreciated that almost as much as she resented having to sit there at all. Lily nodded through the explanation, asked 2 crisp questions about timing and confidentiality, then followed Denise through the clinic door without looking back. Noah watched her go with the tense stillness Claire had come to recognize. As the shape his fear took, he did not pace, he did not fidget. He sat with his forearms on his knees and stared at the floor tiles as if they might crack under the pressure of what he was holding in. When Lily came back 20 minutes later with a cotton ball taped inside her elbow, she was pale but steady. "Phase 1 done," she said, dropping into the chair beside them. "They'll call in a few days." Claire tried to smile. "How do you feel?" "Annoyed," Lily said. "Mostly that I had to miss chemistry for this." That made Noah let out the smallest breath of laughter, and for one moment the room felt almost survivable. It lasted less than 48 hours. The first call came Wednesday afternoon. Lily was in the library. Claire was at work. Noah was halfway through a panel replacement in Puyallup. Lily texted the family group chat first. They confirmed the blood type. "I'm compatible on that level. They want to do more testing. Call me when you can." Claire saw the message in the middle of reviewing a denial appeal and felt the office around her lose focus for half a second. Compatible. Just one word. But it changed the shape of everything. She called Lily immediately and heard her daughter's voice pick up on the second ring, level but thinner than usual. "It doesn't mean yes," Lily said before Claire could speak. "I know. It just means the next step makes medical sense." Claire closed her office door. "I know that too." Lily was quiet for a beat. "I just don't want everyone acting like the decision's already made because a lab value lined up." Claire leaned back against the desk. "No one in this family is going to do that to you." That evening, Lily came home again. Noah had already cleared a space at the kitchen table. Not for legal paperwork this time, but for the stack of transplant forms Denise had emailed over. HLA testing, independent donor advocate information, psychological screening, ethics review, if needed. It looked, Claire thought grimly, like the bureaucratic side of a moral crisis. Lily dropped into a chair, skimmed the top form, and said, "I want to keep going." Noah looked up sharply. "To get information?" "To get all of it," she said. "I'm not deciding blind." He nodded once, but Claire could see the strain at the corners of his mouth. "Okay." The story might still have remained private if not for the insurance form. A week later, after Lily had submitted additional paperwork through the student health system, someone somewhere connected the wrong dots and then sold them. That was the only explanation anyone could come up with afterward. The first article hit on a Thursday morning, under a headline so lurid Claire felt sick reading it. "Billionaire expat seeks dying chance through Oregon granddaughter." By noon, 3 more outlets had picked it up. Betrayal? A cable news segment was calling it an ethical firestorm at the intersection of family, money, and bodily autonomy. By dinner, Lily's name was trending locally. The article had too much. Ray Bennett's illness. The estimated value of his estate. Noah's estrangement. Lily's age. Her pre-med status. Quotes from transplant ethicists who had never met her, and social media commentators already treating her body like a public referendum. Some framed her as noble before she had agreed to anything. Others framed her as selfish before she had even spoken. None of them seemed interested in the simplest fact. She was a 19-year-old student who had asked for time to think. By Friday morning, strangers were messaging her on Instagram. Some begged her to save a life. Some warned her not to sell an organ for family money, though the inheritance wasn't even conditional. One woman wrote, "A good daughter would do this." Another wrote, "Don't let old men buy pieces of you." Lily turned off notifications by breakfast. When Claire called her at noon, Lily answered on the first ring but sounded hollow with exhaustion. "There's a reporter outside the biology building," she said. "He asked if I'd comment on the transplant dilemma." Claire gripped the phone tighter. "Where are you now?" "In the student union bathroom, hiding, apparently." Noah was already on his way to campus before Claire finished the sentence. By the time they got there, Lily was sitting in a quiet corner booth with her backpack clutched to her chest and a paper cup of untouched coffee in front of her. She looked furious, embarrassed, and very young all at once. Noah sat beside her without a word. Claire slid into the seat across from them. "This is insane," Lily said. "I haven't even made a decision." Claire looked at her daughter's drawn face and understood with a clarity that felt like anger hardening into purpose. The story was no longer only about whether Lily would donate. It was about whether the world was going to let her remain a person while she decided. By the time they got Lily home from campus, the story had already outrun them. Claire could see it happening in real time from the passenger seat as Noah drove back toward Tacoma. Her phone kept lighting up in her lap, calls from numbers she didn't recognize, emails from reporters, a text from someone in hospital communications asking whether she wanted to issue a statement before her employer was contacted directly. Noah's phone buzzed twice with missed calls from contractors he knew, then once from a number with a Seattle area code that neither of them answered. Beside him, Lily sat rigid in the back seat, one knee pulled up, staring out the window at the blur of freeway traffic and gray sky. She had turned her phone face down after the fifth message and hadn't touched it since. At home, Claire made tea. Nobody drank. Noah locked the front door, then checked it again a minute later, without seeming to realize he'd already done it. Lily sat at the kitchen table with her backpack still on one shoulder until Claire gently reached over and slid it off for her. The room felt charged, too full of silence, like a house waiting for a storm to hit the roof. It arrived at 6:12 in the form of the doorbell. All three of them froze. Noah was already moving when it rang a second time. Claire followed him into the foyer, with Lily close enough behind that Claire could feel her there. Through the frosted glass panel beside the front door, she could make out the blurred outline of a woman holding an umbrella. Something about the posture, the narrow shoulders, the way she stood as though she still expected doors to open for her, made Claire's stomach go cold before Noah even touched the lock. When he opened the door, her mother was standing on the porch. Elaine Whitmore looked older than Claire remembered, though not softer. Her hair, once the kind of dark blonde she had spent money preserving, was threaded heavily with gray now and pinned back too tightly from her face. She wore a camel coat, expensive boots, and the expression of someone trying very hard to look wounded rather than calculating. Rain speckled the shoulders of her coat and dampened the umbrella in her hand. "Claire," she said, and just hearing her voice after all those years felt wrong, like a sound from a house that had burned down. "I saw the article." Noah did not step aside. "Then you can leave." Elaine's eyes flickered to him and away again, as though even now she disliked having to acknowledge him directly. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "I'm here because Lily is being dragged into something she's too young to understand." Lily made a sharp sound behind Claire, somewhere between disbelief and anger. Claire stared at her mother. "You don't get to say her name like you know her." Elaine's face tightened. "I know enough. I know she's 19. I know there's a dying man and a fortune involved, and I know exactly how dangerous that combination is." Claire gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's interesting coming from you." "I'm serious." Elaine took a step closer to the threshold. This is coercion, Claire. It may not be explicit, but it's there. Money changes how people think. Public pressure changes how people think. She needs protection. Noah's voice stayed low, which somehow made it more final. You had 19 years to protect her. For a moment, something flashed across Elaine's face. Shame, maybe, or irritation at being interrupted. It was hard to tell. I am trying to do the right thing now. No, Claire said. You're trying to arrive late and still control the ending. That landed. Elaine's mouth parted, then closed again. She shifted her grip on the umbrella. Your father wanted me not to come, if you can believe that. He said you'd slam the door in my face, but when I saw what they were saying online, when I saw what this could become, I couldn't stay out of it. Claire's chest tightened at the mention of her father, not from longing, but from the old, familiar rage of hearing that man's preferences presented as if they still deserved weight in her life. This isn't your family crisis to manage. I'm her grandmother. No, Lily said from behind them, her voice clear and shaking only at the edges. You're my mother's mother. That's not the same thing. The porch went still. Elaine turned then, finally really seeing Lily. And for one strange second, Claire watched something like recognition pass over her face. Not love, not pride, but the stunned realization of a person confronted with the living consequence of their own cruelty. Lily stood barefoot on the hallway runner in jeans and an old UW sweatshirt, her arms crossed tight over herself, eyes bright with fury. Elaine softened her tone immediately, and that shift was so practiced it made Claire want to slam the door on instinct alone. Lily, sweetheart, I know this is overwhelming. Don't, Lily said. Elaine stopped. You don't get to call me that. You don't get to act like you care because reporters showed up. That isn't fair. Lily let out a small, stunned laugh. Fair? She stepped closer now. Not enough to be reckless. Just enough to stop hiding behind Claire and Noah. You ignored me for 19 years. You didn't come when I was born. You didn't come when I started school. You didn't come when I got into college. But now that there's money and headlines and doctors talking on TV, suddenly you're here? Elaine's face had gone pale. I was wrong, she said, and for the first time her voice cracked. About a lot of things. But that doesn't mean I'm wrong about this. You should not let that family use you. Noah's head lifted slightly. Claire knew that look. He had been holding himself in check for several minutes, and his patience had just ended. That family? He repeated quietly. The one your daughter chose when you threw her out in the snow? The one that stayed? The one that raised Lily while you pretended she didn't exist? Elaine flinched. Claire folded her arms. Say what you really came here to say. For a second, her mother said nothing. Then the truth slipped out wearing the clothes of concern. If Lily becomes attached to them publicly, if she lets herself get tied to the Bennett name, in all this people will connect all of us to it, to the scandal, to the money, to the choices. And there it was. Not Lily's safety, not bodily autonomy, not regret. Reputation. Claire felt something inside her go very still. After everything after the door, the email, the years of silence, her mother had still arrived, thinking image was the most important wound in the room. Noah took one step forward onto the porch. Get off our property. Elaine looked at Claire, one last appeal rising into her eyes. Please, don't shut me out again. Claire held her gaze without blinking. I didn't shut you out. You socked away and locked. Then she reached forward and closed the door. Through the wood, they could hear nothing for a few seconds except the rain, then the faint retreat of heels on wet concrete. Lily stood motionless in the hallway. Claire turned to her, expecting tears, anger, anything. Instead, Lily let out one long breath and said, in a voice flat with disgust, She still thinks this is about names. And in that moment, Claire understood that some people do not return because love finally found them. They return because the world has changed, and they are terrified of what the truth might cost them. Elaine's footsteps had barely faded from the porch before the next stage of the nightmare took shape. The hospital scheduled Lily's ethics review for the following Wednesday. A formal hearing triggered by exactly the things the media would not stop circling. Her age, the inheritance, the estrangement, the public scrutiny, and the fact that she was pre-med, which one columnist had called a dangerous recipe for self-sacrifice. Claire hated that phrase. It turned her daughter into an abstract argument, instead of what she actually was, a 19-year-old girl being asked to make a decision about her own body while strangers debated her morality online. Rain covered Seattle in a gray sheen that afternoon, turning the hospital windows into dull mirrors. Claire rode the elevator up with Noah and Lily in silence, each of them carrying a different version of fear. Lily looked composed, but not untouched. Noah looked like a man holding himself together by force. Claire felt cold despite the overheated building and the stale smell of coffee, paper, and antiseptic in the halls. The conference room was bright in the sterile way institutions confuse with fairness. A long table, glass walls, a pitcher of water no one poured. At one end sat the ethics committee, a transplant physician, a psychiatrist, a donor advocate, a hospital attorney, a social worker, and the chair, Dr. Irene Walsh, who spoke with the practiced calm of someone used to standing in the middle of other people's impossible choices. At the other end stood a rolling screen already connected to a video call. A minute later, Ray Bennett appeared on it from a private hospital room in England, gaunter than Claire had imagined, his skin drawn tight, his face hollowed by illness. It was the first time Noah had seen his father in more than 30 years. He didn't move. Dr. Walsh explained the process. Their job was not to convince Lily to donate or refuse. Their job was to determine whether her decision would be informed, voluntary, and free from coercion. Lily nodded once. Claire looked at her daughter and thought, with a kind of aching pride, that she seemed both terribly young and completely impossible to push where she did not want to go. Ray spoke first. His voice was rough and weak, but he did not hide behind it. He admitted he had abandoned Noah. He admitted he had no moral claim on Lily. He admitted that leaving money to Noah, while also asking for medical help, created a situation that looked ugly from every angle. "I know what this seems like," he said. "Maybe it is what it seems like. A man who ran out of time and came back needing something. But the inheritance is not conditional. She owes me nothing. I only wanted the chance to ask before I died." Noah kept his eyes on the table. Then came the medical review, then the psychological one. The psychiatrist confirmed that Lily understood every major risk: surgery, recovery, future health complications, pregnancy considerations, the possibility of regret. The donor advocate confirmed that Lily had repeatedly said her parents were not pressuring her. That mattered more to Claire than she expected. It felt like the truth of their family being entered into a permanent record. Then Dr. Walsh asked whether anyone present had information relevant to outside pressure on Lily. The door opened. Elaine Whitmore stepped into the room. For one suspended second, nobody spoke. Claire felt the shock go through her body like a hard drop. Elaine's coat was damp from the rain, her hair pulled back too tightly, her face arranged into concern. "I'm Dr. Elaine Whitmore," she said. "I'm Lily's maternal grandmother, and I have serious concerns about coercion." Noah turned in his chair so slowly, it looked dangerous. Dr. Walsh's expression hardened. "This is a closed review." Elaine pressed on. "She's 19. There's a multi-million-dollar inheritance involved. The entire country is watching. If that doesn't create pressure, what does?" Lily turned toward her. "You do not get to be here," Elaine faltered. "Lily, no." Lily's voice stayed level. "You ignored me for 19 years. You don't get to walk into a hospital hearing and act like you're protecting me now." The room went completely still. Claire stood before she fully realized she was doing it. She pulled the folder from her bag and handed it to Dr. Walsh. "This is relevant," she said. Inside were the documents Claire had kept for years. The email from her parents' assistant, saying they had no granddaughter. The ER record from the night stress nearly sent her into early labor after being thrown out. And Elaine's recent messages trying to insert herself into Lily's decision. Evidence, line by line, that the woman now invoking concern had spent 19 years choosing absence. When Claire finished, nobody looked at Elaine. Dr. Walsh turned to Lily. "You have full capacity to decide," she said. "Do you consent to donation?" Lily stood. "No," she said. Clear. Final. "I'm sorry he's dying, but I'm 19, and I am allowed to keep all of my body. That is my answer." After the hearing, the silence in the car felt different from the silence that had followed other battles. This one was not fear, it was release, thin and shaky at first, but real. Noah drove with both hands fixed on the wheel, his jaw no longer clenched hard enough to hurt. Lily sat in the back seat with her shoes kicked off, one knee tucked under her, staring out at the rain-slick freeway lights as Seattle blurred behind them. Claire turned once to look at her daughter and saw not guilt, not doubt, but exhaustion. The kind that comes after holding your ground in a room full of people who wanted something from you. Ray Bennett died 11 weeks later. The email from Hargrove and Tate arrived just after dawn on a Monday, formal and brief. Claire read it standing at the kitchen counter while the coffee brewed. Noah read it twice, then set his phone down and stood very still. There were no dramatics, no speeches, no sudden forgiveness, just the quiet fact of an ending. A man who had abandoned his son had come back too late, asked for more than he had earned, and died with the answer he deserved. Still, attached to the legal notice, was one last personal statement, dictated before the end. He wrote that Lily had been right to refuse. He wrote that he was relieved she had chosen herself. He wrote that the money was not payment, only apology. And even that word felt too small for 30 years. The transfer cleared 6 days later. For one surreal week, Claire kept checking the account like it might vanish if she looked away too long. $12 million did not feel like money at first. It felt like distortion. Like a number from another family's life, accidentally dropped into theirs. Noah reacted to it the same way he reacted to most things that frightened him, by making lists. He sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote categories in block letters. Lily's education, debt-free forever, business expansion, emergency savings, taxes, a fund for families like theirs. Claire watched him from across the table and thought, with a rush of fierce love, that this was exactly why her parents had been wrong all along. Give a cruel man wealth, and he will use it to make people smaller. Give a good man wealth, and the first thing he asks is who else can breathe easier because of it. They set aside enough to carry Lily through medical school without loans. Noah expanded Bennett Electric slowly, refusing every flashy idea anyone suggested and choosing instead to hire 2 apprentices from difficult backgrounds who needed someone to trust them early. Claire pushed for something else too, something she had wanted for years without ever imagining she might have the means to build it. A small grant fund for young mothers cut off by their families. First month's rent, child care help, medical bills, quiet rescue, no speeches attached. The last insult came in spring. A colleague forwarded Claire a glossy magazine profile on Dr. Elaine Whitmore, framed as a thoughtful reflection on family, public scandal, and intergenerational healing. In it, her mother claimed she had always watched from a distance and had only stayed away because some wounds require time before reconciliation becomes possible. Claire read the line once, then again, and felt something colder than anger settle inside her. Not because it hurt, because it didn't anymore. It was only disgusting. That night, Lily read the article at the kitchen table and let out one sharp laugh. "She still wants credit," she said. Claire looked at her daughter, at Noah washing dishes, at the warm lights of the house they had built from almost nothing, and understood the final lesson of it all. Some people lose you and learn. Others lose you and rewrite the story so they can still sleep at night. Either way, the loss is theirs, not yours.